In 1873, Emma Richter became the center of a medical and societal mystery that puzzled professionals and fascinated the public. She was a young girl, reportedly in good health before a sudden onset of strange, unexplained symptoms began to surface. These symptoms did not align with any known disease or condition at the time, and they quickly captured the attention of both local physicians and national news outlets. What began as isolated complaints, headaches, fainting spells, a loss of appetite, soon evolved into something far more alarming. Emma began to exhibit symptoms that defied the conventional understanding of human biology. She would enter trance-like states, experience violent convulsions without any apparent trigger, and at times, would go days without food or water, all while maintaining a pulse and stable respiration that bewildered those observing her. Doctors were initially confident they would find an explanation. The common medical theories of the time revolved around hysteria, a diagnosis frequently and unfairly applied to women and young girls in the 19th century. However, Emma's symptoms didn't neatly fit the typical manifestations of hysteria, and the persistence and extremity of her condition made it difficult to dismiss her case as psychological alone. Local physicians, after conducting standard examinations, were quick to refer her to more prominent specialists in urban centers. Some of the best minds in the region came to observe Emma. They recorded her behaviors, monitored her body for signs of known ailments, and debated possible causes, epilepsy, sleep disorders, malnutrition, but nothing accounted for the full range of her symptoms. There were no consistent patterns, no predictable triggers, and most disturbingly, no definitive answers. Adding to the mystery was Emma's physical transformation. Over the course of a few weeks, her body seemed to change in ways that suggested some internal process was drastically out of alignment. Her skin took on an unusually pale tone, her muscles atrophied despite no visible signs of illness, and her eyes often appeared sunken, glassy, and distant. There were periods when she would not speak for days, and then, suddenly, she would awaken from her silence and recount vivid, detailed experiences she claimed occurred during her unconsciousness, conversations with figures long dead, visions of events that she could not possibly have known about. These accounts led some to suggest that Emma was not merely suffering from a medical issue, but was instead a spiritual conduit or psychic medium, a theory gaining popularity in certain circles at the time. The town where Emma lived became a temporary hub for curious minds. Clergy, journalists, doctors, and laypeople all made their way to her home, hoping to witness one of her episodes firsthand. Her family, initially overwhelmed by the situation, began to play a role in facilitating these visits, sometimes charging fees or accepting donations. The house became a strange mix of hospital ward and spectacle hall. Some observers came away convinced that Emma was truly experiencing something supernatural, while others left certain she was suffering from a severe and misunderstood neurological or psychological condition. As more people learned about Emma Richter's case, the debate intensified. Was this a case of mass delusion, spurred by the growing popularity of spiritualism? Or was Emma exhibiting a new, unknown disorder that science had yet to classify? The available medical tools of the time were limited. There were no MRIs, no EEGs, no modern lab tests. Diagnoses relied heavily on physical examination, anecdotal observation, and a great deal of speculation. This made Emma's case particularly frustrating for those attempting to apply rational, scientific methods to understand her condition. Emma's symptoms continued to shift over time. She began to lose the ability to walk without explanation. She experienced prolonged periods of unconsciousness during which her vital signs remained stable. She sometimes spoke in languages she had never been taught, or made references to events that had occurred hundreds of miles away. Some observers believed she was fabricating the entire thing, perhaps with the help of her family. Others pointed out the toll on her physical health as evidence that this could not simply be an act. Still others argued that whether conscious or not, Emma's condition was a window into the limitations of contemporary medical science. The public and medical reactions to Emma Richter's condition in 1873 were as varied as they were intense. In a time when medical knowledge was still developing and spiritualist movements were gaining traction, Emma's case quickly became more than just a personal ordeal, it became a social phenomenon. News of her strange condition spread rapidly through word of mouth, local newspapers, and eventually larger national publications. Reporters wrote sensational accounts of a girl whose body defied nature, whose mind seemed connected to another realm, and whose life challenged everything people thought they knew about science and medicine. These reports often exaggerated or dramatized details, but they served to amplify public curiosity and fuel widespread debate. Doctors were among the first to take interest, though not always with uniform motivations. Some approached the case with sincere concern, attempting to use Emma's symptoms as an opportunity to test the boundaries of current medical understanding. Others, however, saw the attention surrounding her as a chance to elevate their own reputations. Competing diagnoses began to emerge from different medical camps, each trying to explain Emma's unexplainable behavior through the lens of their own theories. Some physicians claimed her symptoms were psychosomatic, an extreme form of hysteria or catalepsy, while others suggested that she was experiencing a rare form of epilepsy or perhaps even a neurological infection not yet categorized in medical texts. Despite these efforts, none of the doctors could offer consistent or verifiable explanations. This failure led to growing skepticism in some quarters, but it also gave room for alternative theories to take hold. As the scientific community stumbled, the public became more divided. In the eyes of many everyday citizens, Emma represented either a miraculous anomaly or a living symbol of spiritual truth. The atmosphere of the time played a major role in shaping these views. The 19th century was an era of both great scientific progress and deep religious and spiritual curiosity. Darwin's theories were still fresh and controversial, and the tension between science and faith was ever present. People were grappling with the limits of human knowledge, and Emma's mysterious illness seemed to sit directly at the heart of that conflict. In many towns and cities, religious leaders spoke about Emma from the pulpit, referencing her case as either divine punishment, spiritual awakening, or proof of the supernatural. Spiritualist groups, which were growing rapidly in influence during this period, saw Emma as validation of their beliefs. They claimed that her trances and visions were not medical phenomena at all, but rather evidence that the soul could reach beyond the physical world. Mediums and clairvoyants sent letters to Emma's family, offering their interpretations of her condition, while others made pilgrimages to her town to witness her episodes firsthand. For these individuals, Emma wasn't just a sick girl, she was a vessel through which otherworldly forces communicated. At the same time, skeptics and scientists who adhered strictly to rationalism began to criticize the media frenzy and public hysteria surrounding Emma. Some accused newspapers of exploiting the story for profit. Others denounced Emma's family, suggesting that they were perpetuating a hoax, either for financial gain or out of some psychological need for attention. These accusations were often harsh and personal, sometimes suggesting that Emma was a fraud, or worse, mentally unstable. Still, these claims did little to slow the growing fascination. In fact, the controversy only added fuel to the fire. The more people argued over Emma's condition, the more curious the public became. What if she really was different? What if medicine wasn't enough to explain everything? This climate of uncertainty, fear, and wonder made Emma's story more than just a medical mystery, it became a cultural touchstone. Doctors continued to visit her, each hoping to solve the puzzle. Some brought early instruments to test her responses to light, touch, and sound. Others simply observed in silence, hoping to find clues in her behavior. But no consensus ever emerged. The lack of a clear diagnosis began to frustrate not just the professionals, but also the public. People began to look beyond doctors for answers, embracing increasingly unorthodox explanations. The failure of science to account for Emma's condition left a vacuum that was quickly filled with superstition, religious fervor, and philosophical speculation. As newspapers followed her story, Emma Richter became a household name in many communities. Letters poured in, offering advice, remedies, and even marriage proposals. Her home was inundated with visitors. Some came with skepticism, others with hope, still others with cameras and notebooks, ready to document the impossible. The attention became overwhelming, both for Emma and her family. Yet the public's appetite for stories like hers remained insatiable. She was no longer just a young girl battling a strange illness, she was a figure of national curiosity, a symbol of mystery that lay at the intersection of medicine, belief, and the unknown. The rise of spiritualism and pseudoscience during the mid to late 19th century created a fertile backdrop for cases like that of Emma Richter. In 1873, America was in the midst of a cultural and intellectual transition. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the social fabric, science was advancing rapidly, and yet, paradoxically, belief in the supernatural was reaching new heights. Spiritualism, the belief that the living could communicate with the dead, had taken root in both America and Europe, spreading quickly through seances, mediums, and public demonstrations. In such a climate, any unexplained medical or psychological condition was not only a concern for doctors, but often seen as a potential spiritual manifestation. Emma's symptoms, her trance-like states, spontaneous utterances, and apparent detachment from the physical world, fit perfectly within this emerging framework of spiritual interpretation. The spiritualist movement had already gained momentum decades earlier, particularly after the famous case of the Fox sisters in the 1840s. By the time Emma Richter's case surfaced, spiritualist societies had been established in most major cities. These groups blended religious faith, metaphysical speculation, and pseudo-medical theories into a belief system that rejected many traditional scientific principles. Mediums were treated like authorities, not only on the spirit world but often on physical and mental health. In this context, Emma was not simply seen as sick, she was considered gifted, chosen, or burdened with abilities that regular science couldn't comprehend. Her trances were interpreted not as symptoms of illness, but as states of spiritual communication or possession. Her apparent knowledge of events she had no way of knowing about was framed as clairvoyance, and her resistance to food or water was viewed by some as a divine phenomenon, similar to religious fasting or miraculous endurance described in Christian hagiographies. Many people drawn to Emma's case were not trained in medicine or science, but were instead part of this growing spiritualist movement. They arrived with preconceived ideas about what her condition meant and projected those beliefs onto her symptoms. Some believed she was a portal to the afterlife, others saw her as a reincarnated prophet, and a few even thought she was under attack from malevolent forces and needed protection. In the absence of a firm scientific explanation, these spiritual interpretations gained ground rapidly. Emma's home became a site of spiritual gatherings. Mediums attempted to communicate with her during her unconscious episodes. People claimed to see auras or hear disembodied voices during their visits. Stories of miraculous events began to circulate, many of which were difficult to verify but widely believed. This rise of spiritualism was closely accompanied by an increase in pseudoscientific practices. Homeopathy, mesmerism, phrenology, and various forms of alternative healing were gaining popularity, despite lacking empirical validation. Practitioners of these methods often presented themselves as more compassionate and intuitive than the cold, clinical doctors of mainstream medicine. They claimed to treat the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. Emma became a target for these pseudoscientific figures, many of whom insisted they could cure or at least explain her condition. Homeopaths offered diluted tinctures, mesmerists tried to realign her energies through hypnotic states, phrenologists examined the shape of her skull, looking for bumps and indentations that might reveal the source of her affliction. These practices, while lacking in scientific rigor, were widely accepted by segments of the population who felt disillusioned by the limitations of conventional medicine. The failure of doctors to resolve Emma's condition only strengthened the hand of the pseudoscientific and spiritualist communities. They pointed to Emma as proof that science did not have all the answers. Some publications even began to frame her case as a confrontation between two worldviews, rational empiricism versus intuitive mysticism. This dichotomy played out not just in academic circles, but in living rooms, churches, and public lectures. Emma's case was referenced in debates, sermons, and pamphlets arguing for or against spiritualism. The broader social implications of this were significant. Emma's case helped to legitimize spiritualism in the eyes of many followers. It provided a contemporary example that could be cited alongside ancient religious miracles and mythological accounts. Her image began to appear in spiritualist literature, and her name was invoked in discussions of faith healing, psychic phenomena, and the existence of life beyond death. At the same time, her case highlighted how quickly public perception could be swayed when science fell short. In the absence of clear answers, belief systems, however ungrounded, filled the void. This was not unique to Emma, but her story became emblematic of a wider cultural phenomenon where science, spirituality, and pseudoscience collided. Emma Richter's case in 1873 emerged at a time when women's roles in medicine, both as patients and as subjects of study, were deeply influenced by cultural, social, and scientific biases. The 19th-century medical establishment was largely male-dominated, and the prevailing view of women's health was shaped by a combination of outdated theories, moral judgments, and limited empirical understanding. Women were often seen as more emotionally unstable, physically delicate, and biologically predisposed to certain kinds of illnesses, particularly those related to the nervous system. This framework heavily influenced how Emma was perceived, diagnosed, and treated by the medical community. Her symptoms were not just interpreted through the lens of physiology, but through a gendered lens that saw young women as especially prone to mysterious, psychological, or spiritual maladies. At the time, diagnoses like female hysteria were common catch-alls for a wide range of unexplained symptoms in women. These could include fainting, nervousness, insomnia, irritability, sexual desire, and trance-like states, many of which were present in Emma's condition. Rather than investigate potential neurological or systemic causes, doctors often defaulted to explanations that blamed the female reproductive system or emotional instability. The uterus was still believed by some to wander in the body, causing hysteria and other physical disturbances. This outdated theory, although already debunked in more progressive medical circles, still lingered in rural areas and among traditional practitioners. Emma, a young girl just entering adolescence, was therefore viewed as being in a particularly vulnerable phase of life, where her changing body was assumed to be the root of any mental or physical disruptions. Emma's gender did not only affect how doctors treated her medically, it also influenced how society treated her symbolically. In many ways, she became a canvas onto which broader anxieties about femininity, purity, and control were projected. Her behavior, uncontrolled, erratic, unexplainable, was unsettling in a time when women were expected to be docile, obedient, and physically modest. Her public visibility as a sick girl who defied explanation challenged these norms. While some saw her as a victim of spiritual forces or divine intervention, others viewed her with suspicion, questioning whether she was acting out, seeking attention, or even possessed by immoral impulses. The idea of a young woman drawing so much public attention simply by being ill disturbed the Victorian-era ideal of the quiet, suffering woman who bore her burdens in silence. Interestingly, Emma's case also intersected with the emerging presence of women in the medical field. While still rare, women were beginning to enter medical schools and advocate for better understanding of female anatomy and health. Some female doctors and nurses who encountered Emma's case responded with empathy and skepticism toward the mainstream diagnoses being offered by their male counterparts. They questioned whether Emma's condition was being misunderstood or exaggerated due to gender bias. A few suggested that her symptoms could be related to trauma, hormonal shifts, or neurological disorders that were not yet fully understood or acknowledged by male physicians. These women represented a slowly shifting tide in medicine, one that sought to challenge entrenched views of the female body as inherently pathological or unstable. The case also brought to light how little autonomy women and girls had over their medical care. Emma's family, particularly male relatives or authority figures, were often the ones communicating with doctors, managing the visits, and making decisions about her treatment. Emma herself was rarely asked to explain her experience in her own words, and when she did speak, her words were frequently filtered through interpretations by doctors, clergy, or journalists. Her body became the subject of examination, discussion, and spectacle, but her voice was often sidelined. This mirrored a broader pattern in 19th-century medicine, where women's experiences were routinely discounted or reframed to fit existing narratives. Public fascination with Emma's case also revealed how society projected its expectations and fears onto young women. To some, Emma was an innocent girl touched by mystery, perhaps even chosen for a divine or supernatural purpose. To others, she was a deceptive figure, a symbol of female unpredictability and emotional excess. In both interpretations, she was rarely viewed as a complex individual with agency and a unique experience of illness. Instead, she was used as a symbol in debates that extended far beyond her personal suffering. Her gender made her both vulnerable and powerful in the public eye, vulnerable to misdiagnosis and mistreatment, but powerful as a figure who could captivate national attention, disrupt medical authority, and ignite broader conversations about the limits of science, the role of women in society, and the nature of the human mind. Media sensationalism played a pivotal role in amplifying public fascination with Emma Richter's condition in 1873. The press, still evolving in its relationship to both fact and spectacle, found in Emma's case the perfect storm of mystery, controversy, and emotional intrigue. Her story was inherently dramatic, a young girl suffering from unexplainable symptoms, doctors at a loss, spiritualists claiming supernatural involvement, and a community torn between skepticism and belief. This kind of narrative was irresistible to newspapers of the time, many of which thrived on bold headlines, serialized human interest stories, and the blending of entertainment with information. Almost overnight, Emma became a media figure, her every twitch and trance reported with theatrical flair. Local papers were the first to pick up her story, often relying on second-hand reports, family statements, or brief doctor interviews. The tone was typically awestruck or sympathetic, framing Emma as either a miracle or a medical mystery. These stories were picked up and reprinted by larger regional papers, and eventually, her case was featured in national publications. With each retelling, the story grew more embellished. Reports described her fainting episodes in poetic detail, emphasized the dewy glow of her skin, or claimed she spoke in ancient tongues. Phrases like science-defying girl and child touched by forces unknown began appearing in headlines. Illustrations, often wildly exaggerated, showed Emma lying on a bed with ghostly figures hovering nearby or doctors recoiling in confusion. This coverage had a profound impact on how the public perceived Emma and her condition. For many readers who had no access to first-hand information, the press became their only window into the events. The blending of factual reporting with speculative or outright fictionalized elements created a distorted version of Emma's reality. Instead of being seen as a patient in distress, she became a kind of mythic figure, a symbol of the unknown. This transformation from person to spectacle had consequences, not only for Emma's privacy and health, but for the broader discourse around science, illness, and belief. Sensationalized media turned her into a public property, someone whose story could be shaped, sold, and consumed for entertainment. Newspapers were not just reporting the story, they were influencing it. As attention grew, so did the number of visitors to Emma's home. Journalists arrived alongside spiritualists, physicians, and curious onlookers, each hoping to witness or uncover something extraordinary. In many cases, their mere presence shaped Emma's experience. The pressure to produce signs or episodes in front of observers added psychological strain. The family, perhaps unintentionally, may have started to accommodate these expectations, allowing more access to Emma, timing visits to coincide with her more dramatic symptoms, or even altering the home environment to suit the narrative being spun by the press. The more dramatic the story became, the more valuable it was, both in print and in person. Certain newspapers went beyond simply reporting and began editorializing Emma's case to fit larger ideological or cultural arguments. Religious publications framed her story as evidence of divine activity or spiritual warfare, while secular or skeptical editors used her case to mock spiritualism and question public gullibility. In both cases, Emma's individuality was lost in favor of her symbolic value. She became a tool in cultural debates, her suffering reduced to an anecdote in support of one worldview or another. The media's role in shaping these narratives demonstrated the power of storytelling in influencing public belief, particularly when scientific certainty was lacking. The rise of photography and printed imagery during this era also contributed to Emma's public image. Though many portraits and images were fictionalized or stylized, they helped cement the idea of Emma as a character rather than a person. She was often depicted as ghost-like, with wide, haunted eyes, lying motionless under heavy blankets, surrounded by bewildered doctors or shadowy figures. These visuals evoked Gothic literature and spiritualist iconography, adding a layer of drama that printed text alone couldn't achieve. For readers, especially those far removed from her actual location, these images made the story more vivid and more believable. They turned Emma into a living myth. In the midst of this media circus, the line between truth and spectacle became increasingly blurred. Eyewitness accounts contradicted press reports. Some doctors who had visited Emma publicly distanced themselves from the more exaggerated claims, insisting that she was simply ill and not supernatural in any sense. Still, their more measured voices were often drowned out by the louder, more fantastical versions of the story being circulated. The sensational press found more value in mystery than in clarity, and the public, hungry for wonder, rewarded this approach with attention and belief. The legacy of Emma Richter's case lies not only in the mystery surrounding her condition but in how her story shaped the cultural dialogue between science and belief, skepticism and wonder, medicine and mystery. Long after the headlines faded and public interest shifted, Emma's name remained a reference point in discussions about the limitations of scientific understanding and the need for critical inquiry. Her case was cited in journals, sermons, and lecture halls as an example of how society reacts when it encounters something it cannot explain. For skeptics and rationalists, she represented the dangers of drawing conclusions without evidence, a symbol of how easily people can be swayed by spectacle, emotion, and the promise of something beyond ordinary experience. For spiritualists and believers in the paranormal, Emma's story was proof that science did not hold all the answers and that there were forces at work in the world that defied measurement and classification. As medical knowledge expanded in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many retrospective analyses were attempted to explain Emma's symptoms in modern terms. Some suggested she might have suffered from a rare neurological condition such as epilepsy, dissociative identity disorder, or conversion disorder. Others believed she could have been part of a psychosomatic cycle, exacerbated by stress, attention, and societal pressure. Still others theorized that Emma's condition may have been unintentionally influenced by her environment, especially the overwhelming public and media interest in her symptoms. In this view, her mind and body may have responded unconsciously to the expectations placed upon her, creating an illness narrative that was both genuine and shaped by the context in which it unfolded. The case also became an early and vivid example of what later came to be known as the medical gaze, a term used to describe how the medical establishment often reduces patients to a set of symptoms or observable phenomena, ignoring their personal narrative, emotions, and social context. Emma was examined, observed, and recorded, but rarely listened to in a meaningful way. Her inner experience was secondary to what could be seen, measured, or sensationalized. This reduction of the individual to a medical curiosity became a cautionary tale in medical ethics, showing the importance of seeing patients as whole persons rather than puzzles to be solved. Scholars and medical historians later cited her case when discussing the need for empathy and a more holistic approach in medical practice. Emma's legacy also played a role in how future unexplained medical cases were handled. Doctors became more cautious about jumping to spiritual or psychological conclusions without rigorous evidence. Researchers began to place greater emphasis on distinguishing between psychosomatic symptoms and physiological ones. The case contributed to the slow but steady development of neurology and psychiatry as distinct fields, as well as the eventual debunking of many pseudoscientific practices that had thrived in her time. Her story served as a historical marker showing how far medicine had to go, and how easily it could be undermined by public pressure, media influence, and cultural bias. In popular culture, Emma Richter never entirely disappeared. Though her story was not as widely known as other 19th-century figures, it lingered in folklore, local legends, and obscure medical texts. Occasional references to "the girl science couldn't explain" appeared in books on spiritualism, skepticism, and the history of medicine. Her name surfaced in debates about faith healing, placebo effects, and the psychosocial dimensions of illness. For some, she was a forgotten victim of ignorance and exploitation. For others, she remained a mysterious figure who challenged conventional thinking. Writers and artists drew inspiration from her, blending her story into fictional accounts, ghost stories, and cautionary tales about the unknown. The symbolic weight of Emma's story also had implications for how society viewed female patients and their credibility in medical settings. Her case was one of many in which a young woman's suffering was turned into public spectacle, her voice sidelined, and her agency reduced. This pattern repeated itself in other historical cases, where women with chronic pain, unexplained illnesses, or psychological trauma were dismissed, misdiagnosed, or institutionalized. Emma's story, when revisited with a modern lens, helped fuel feminist critiques of medicine and efforts to better understand how gender bias affects diagnosis and treatment. Her legacy thus contributed, in a quiet but meaningful way, to the larger movement toward medical reform and patient advocacy. Ultimately, Emma Richter became a figure around whom many narratives were built: scientific, spiritual, skeptical, feminist, and historical. Each of these interpretations added a layer to her legacy, shaping how future generations thought about mystery in medicine, the limits of human understanding, and the importance of questioning what we think we know. Her story remained a point of reference not because it offered clear answers, but because it reminded people of how much remains unknown and how easily truth can become entangled with belief, fear, and the desire for meaning in the face of the inexplicable. B6